Hi everyone, I'm Abigail, this is Megan, and welcome to another Two Kids interview.
We are joined by New York Times bestselling author Trenton Stewart.
Mr. Stewart is best known for his sensational best-selling book series, The Mysterious Benedict Society.
He also wrote the wonderful and New York Times bestselling book, The Secret Keepers. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you both for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start with the question everybody wants to know the answer to.
On a couple of occasions, you were done writing the Mysterious Benedict Society books.
And then you weren't done.
Are you done now, or can we please have more?
Well, I appreciate the request. I'm glad you'd be interested in seeing another book in the series. It's true, you're on the money. I kept thinking I was finished with the series. So I started out thinking I was just going to write one book. I didn't plan to write a series. And then as I neared the end of that book, I started thinking, this would be, I think I could enjoy writing maybe another book with these characters, maybe even three, but I wasn't sure that I would. And then it eventually became clear that that's what I was going to do. And so I do keep writing the last book in the series, which is getting tricky because those three, I had to finish the trilogy. And then I decided to write about Mr. Benedict when he was a boy. And I felt like that needed to sum everything up. And then some years later, I really felt like I was done. But then I couldn't get out of my head that I wanted to visit with these characters again and see what they've been up to for the last few years. And so I wrote what I call the sequel to the threequel and the prequel. I think I'm done with sequels, and I can't think of anything else that rhymes like that, so I'm probably done.
Main characters in the Mysterious Benedict Society are all orphans.
We've noticed that in a number of classic kids' tales.
Why is that?
That's a great observation. Really, the main thing, I think, for kids' tales in which kids are the ones who solve the problems that they find themselves in, that the writers of those stories feel like they have to get out of the way the people who would protect those kids, that would keep those kids safe and keep them from having to make difficult choices and solve difficult problems. So it was in the spirit of those old books that I made my characters runaways and orphans too. I tried to make it an important part of the story. It certainly helps, I think, the reader pretty quickly sympathize with the character when you think this character has had to deal with some difficult things in their life already. But really, just on a practical level, as Mr. Benedict says in the first book in the series to them, that if you parents won't let you go off on some big adventure, they're not going to let you go off on some big mission, and he doesn't want them to go off on this big mission. He just feels like that's the best way to essentially save everybody, and he gives them the choice to do it. But certainly, if they were in loving, secure families, there's little chance that they would be allowed to go off and risk their skins to save other people.
What is it about riddles and puzzles that you like so much?
That's interesting. I don't think anybody's ever asked me the question exactly like that. What is it that I like so much about them? I'd be curious to know what you think. I've always loved them. I loved them from the time I was your age. Riddles in particular. I think riddles and jokes have a lot in common, that they sort of set up the reader or the listener to pay close attention. And if they work, the person on the other end of the joke or the riddle feels surprised, and it creates a pleasant emotion because if they feel surprised, but it feels right, it seems like, of course that's the answer. It felt like that's where we were going all along. That's why that joke feels funny, or that's why that riddle seems, was so curious and mysterious, but then so satisfying when it's solved. There's a combination of that element of surprise and a feeling of rightness. But I like the trickery in it. I like it. Both jokes and riddles depend on sort of making you look one way and then surprising you by giving you an answer that's the other direction. But riddles in particular, I think that they're really satisfying if the answer is right there in front of you, but it's been made in such a way that it makes you look at the wrong thing or look in the wrong direction. So I always liked the idea from the time you're getting attacked by an insect. From the time I was your age, I think I liked the idea very much of stories in which characters had to solve riddles and puzzles to essentially save themselves or save others or save the day. And one good example of that is in the book The Hobbit. The main character, the Hobbit, Bilbo Baggins, is in this cave in one chapter called Riddles in the Dark, with a scary creature called Gollum, and they end up in a riddle contest. And it's life or death for Bilbo Baggins, the Hobbit. He knows he has to win this contest, or Gollum's gonna get him. And I love that whole book, but I love that chapter more than anything. And so years later, when I started to write a book for young readers, I think that feeling was really a lot of what had to do with why I wrote the book the way that I wrote it.
When you're writing for each character in the book, do you have to change your mindset to get into the character's mind?
Good question. Yeah, to a degree. But it's part of the process is sometimes I might be writing one character and then I realize I need to write a different part of the scene, so I might switch to a different character in the middle of a sentence, right? So you're trying to find your way as a writer to characters doing and saying the things that you think those characters would do or say in a given moment, but you're also changing the moments around because you're trying to create an overall effect on the reader, get certain information across, kind of set up things that will be suspenseful or funny. But yeah, once I've gotten the characters established, and in the case of the Mysterious Benedict Society, those 4 kids, once I figured out who they were, and that was a combination of figuring out what their special talents were and then thinking about what kind of personalities they had that went with that, it got easier and easier the more I wrote them. The more time, just like real people, the more time I spent with them, the easier it became for me to think, well, what would Kate do in this situation? What would she say? What would Rainey do in this situation? What would he say? And so on. So it got easier and easier for me to put myself in basically looking out through their eyes.
You already mentioned The Hobbit. How else are your books influenced by our own childhood?
Yeah, well, certainly by the books that I read in my childhood. I was influenced as a writer of books for kids. So there were a lot of books that I loved that had elements of mystery and adventure, and they had small protagonists, right? So the heroes of the story were often, they were children, they were hobbits, or they were rabbits, like in Watership Down, or or like you have also mice and Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim, and mice and rats, So I think I definitely had a soft spot for big stories, big epic stories with mysterious elements and small characters that are up against the odds, So that influenced me in some way. But I guess also, if you think about my childhood influencing my stories, I would say specifically in The Secret Keepers, we have a story about a kid who's not an orphan. I mean, he doesn't have a father anymore, but he lives with his mother, and he has a really close relationship with his mother, and they joke around all the time. And that was something that was based in a lot of ways on my relationship with my mom when I was a kid. I had a dad too, so I wasn't alone like Reuben is in The Secret Keepers, but we had that particular kind of jokey relationship. And I also, when I was a kid, I roamed my neighborhood a lot, and my best friend for a little while was the neighbor's dog, whose name was Reuben, which is why I ended up naming this kid Reuben. And he wanders around too. He's in an urban setting, right? He's in a big city, and I wasn't. That kind of feeling I had when I was out on my own looking for adventures was the kind of feeling I was trying to put into the mind of that main character, Reuben, because I figured usually as a writer, you always, for young readers, you always have to assume, if I felt like that when I was a kid, I bet a lot of other kids felt that way too. So you just trust that that's going to be appealing to young readers.
Did you write a lot as a child?
Probably more than a lot of kids did. It was interesting. I made up stories all the time. From the time I was 3 years old, I would shush my family and tell them I was thinking, which was my way of describing, that was my term for daydreaming on purpose at great length, right? So I started doing that very early. And then I wanted to write stories down, but you probably remember how it's pretty difficult when you first start to learn to use a pencil. It hurts the hand. It's a lot more work than you want it to be. And so, writing stories down physically is actually a lot of work. And I think as a kid that was a bit of an obstacle for me to write as much as I would have otherwise. But yeah, especially starting about third grade, I started to write really silly poems. And then I started to write some, stories about crocodiles and space battles and that sort of thing.
When you decided to write The Secret Keepers,
which became a New York Times bestseller,
were you worried at all at how a book outside the Benedict world would be received?
Yes, I was. I wouldn't say worried is maybe a strong word for it, but it was a subject of considerable contemplation, I would say. I thought about it. And maybe a little bit of, it was more of a strong wondering. I wonder how this is going to be, right? And sometimes something like worry, but I felt pretty good about the story, and I enjoyed writing something that had a lot in common with the Mysterious Benedict Society books, but was doing its own thing. So I think I felt more optimistic and hopeful, and in the spirit of fun of trying to do a different kind of thing than I was worrying. But it certainly occurred to me, and when I was writing the books in the series, I often thought about the fact that readers of the first book in the series, they love certain elements of it. They love the riddles and puzzles and the way they frame the story. And as a writer, I was trying to strike a balance between giving readers what they really liked about the books. I don't want to disappoint them in that respect. If they get another book in the series, they expect a certain thing to happen, but also wanting to feel free to do what I want to do, that might sometimes not be what readers expect from the books. And so moving to The Secret Keepers to write that book it gave me a little bit more freedom to think. You're less likely as a reader to be disappointed that you didn't have all the things set up the same way that they were in the Mysterious Benedict Society books, because it's a different universe and different characters.
Writing isn't easy, and rejection seems to be a part of most writers' story. Was that a part of your journey at all?
Definitely, it was, and that's an astute observation. I don't know why, at a pretty young age as a writer, I would say in my very early 20s, I made the decision to keep a record of all the rejections in my life and not to resent them. And I think it turned out to be a really good and healthy thing to do. But I'm not sure exactly why I had the insight that would be a good thing for me to do, at least for myself. But I sent a lot of short stories to literary magazines to try to get them published. And I did get several published over the years, but for every story that I got accepted to be published, I had many rejections. And I would keep the rejection letters, and this was all through the US mail. That was the way it was done back then, all the time. So for every rejection letter that I received, or everyone that I received, I kept it in a file folder. And I eventually had a folder about this thick, just, dozens, scores and scores made of rejections, maybe even a couple hundred. But it became it was an interesting artifact in my life. I would open that folder and see all those rejections, but there's something really satisfying to see. It's kind of a path. You can see the path that you took toward your publications and your readership as well when you look at all of those, because the path to selling stories was not, composed of just 4 or 5 stones. There were many, many stones in the path, and most of those stones were attempts that didn't succeed. So I do think it's important for writers to not even accept it, but try to embrace it, the idea that they're going to be rejected along the way, in a wide variety of ways that you might meet with rejection or failure, but that it is part of the process. It's what happens with anybody who's trying to do something difficult. The way you get better and the way you find your way to your goal is going to involve a lot of rejection and failure and mishits and that sort of thing.
What is your process when putting a book together?
Do you decide the end before the middle?
Or do you put it together in order?
I've done it both ways. Usually with the books that I've been writing for young readers, I have had them set up where they're sort of mysteries, right? They're not like a classic mystery, but they have a lot of mysterious elements that characters have to solve, clues and riddles and puzzles and such. And so those things really do need to move in some sort of progression that leads someplace. And it should happen less randomly. One thing depends upon the thing that came before it. And so I did have to be pretty good about trying to plan the way the book was going to unfold, at least in terms of certain major plot points. For that reason, it made sense in most cases for me to start at the beginning and work my way to the end. But I have done, and I'm with my current book, will probably do some of it too. I've done it in such a way that occasionally I might write something that appears later in the story. But just because I really need to work something out. But the thing is, in the end, you write your first draft, and then you're going to write a second draft, and you might work on different parts out of order, but you kind of piece it together or at least I have usually done it that way. I piece it together from beginning to end usually, but I might figure out something near the end that makes me go back and change the beginning. And then I might change something in the middle that makes me realize I need to do something different at the end. So there is a process of discovery and back and forth that is usually part of every book, no matter how I start it.
How much do you revise a book after the first draft?
There are some books it's been hard for me to say, because I didn't just go through from the beginning and write a second draft and then write a third and a fourth. I would work on different parts of the book. So I might revise the middle part of a book, and then realize, like I was saying a minute ago, okay, that means I need to change a different part of the book from the first draft. So it's the great gift of a writer. One of the great gifts that you get as a writer is to get to go back and put stuff in that you didn't think to put in the first time, but you can put it in and work really hard to make it seem like it was there all along. And so it makes writers seem smarter than they actually are. But because of that process, it's often the case that I revise different parts of the books several times, and I don't know really how much that constitutes, like how many drafts does that make? It's multiple mini drafts or partial drafts and that sort of thing. So usually one complete draft that will see some readers, a friend of mine or family members or editors, and then they make suggestions, and then another draft. But in the middle of all that, there are lots of parts of the book that I might rewrite.
Can you tell us about a time when you were doing something and noticed someone or something and thought, I need to put that in a book?
Well, that's a great question. I have to think about that, because I'll write a lot of things down. I'll notice something that I'll think is really interesting, and I'll write it down thinking that I want to put it in a book someday. But I'm trying to think now of something that I have put in a book that I felt that way about, that I observed. I know that there are a lot of good examples, but nothing is necessarily springing to mind. One thing that will happen is that I will see something and I won't really know what's going on, but something about it is really interesting to me. And I'm making this part up, but if I saw, a dog in a tree, I might think, why is that dog in the tree, right? And it might even turn out to be the case that it wasn't a dog, it was a cat that looked like a dog, and I realized that later, or I might misunderstand a song lyric when I hear a song. But often those mistakes are curious enough that they trigger the imagination and make me think, oh, I want to include that in the story somehow, So it does happen all the time.
What writer has had the most influence on you?
I'm not sure. I've read a lot of writers and I love a lot of writers. I would say just not indirectly, it's hard for me to figure out how to characterize it, but in important ways, the writers of those books that I loved when I was young, probably all did. And the ones who wrote the stories that had the elements that I loved the most. So the writers of The Hobbit and Watership Down and the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and others. Those writers probably most strongly influenced the kind of writer I became when I was writing for young kids or for young readers.
What advice do you have for young people who want to write?
Well, if you want to write, my advice is a couple of things. I would suggest that you definitely want to write something that you would want to read yourself. Don't try to write something that you think other people would really be interested in, but you're not that interested in. You really want to write something that you're interested in yourself. You want to tell the kind of story that you like to read. And then that's where most of the power in the storytelling is going to come from. If it's something that really interests you, chances are you work hard at it, it's going to be interesting to some other readers who have a similar kind of interest as you. And then one other thing I would say is that you do learn from doing. So you don't have to feel like you're an expert at writing before you get going on a story or a novel, that you'll learn from writing. So I am among many writers who have written entire books that they didn't publish, and it's fine. It's disappointing sometimes, but you learn so much about writing by doing the writing, and you learn about writing a novel by writing a novel. So you need to not worry about writing something bad. You need to write what interests you, and you'll learn a lot along the way, and you'll get better. And if you don't feel like it's a successful story, the next story, you can use the tools that you picked up along the way and take another stab at writing a good story. The last thing I would say is to follow your joy, and don't worry about finishing stuff. If your parents or your teachers are saying you have to finish a story, you got to learn how to finish and write second drafts, they're right, you do. But if you find that it starts to make you not want to write anymore because you're more interested in jumping over to a different story and you don't want to try to make another one better, then you should jump over to the other story as much as you can, because all great writers have abandoned projects. and they thought, well, this is not working very well. I'm more interested in this other thing. So, do what makes you happy so that you build up momentum as a writer over time. You want to do the things that will make you want to write again the next day. But it's true. Someday you have to figure out how to write a second draft and finish a story if you're having a hard time finishing. But just understand that that's not super important early on. It's not as important as just writing regularly and reading as much as you can. Always be reading.
Can you tell us about a project that you have in the works now?
Sure. I've been working on another novel for young readers that will have things in common with the books that I've published already, like The Secret Keepers and the Mysterious Benedict Society books. So it will feature some young people in challenging situations who have to figure a lot of stuff out. It has a working title called The Starfish and the Scorpion Fly. And that's probably going to be the final title, but we'll see if anything changes after I've finished a draft of it.
Finally, it's time for our Turbo 10.
10 rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
Yes, let me get a drink of water. Okay.
Let's go. Number 1, what is your favorite phrase to use?
I don't know. And that's probably the answer is I don't know.
Number 2, what is one subject you'd love to learn more about?
Astronomy.
Number 3, what is your go-to snack food?
My go-to snack food? Well, I do love bananas and peanut butter.
Number 4, what was your favorite book growing up?
It's probably a tie between The Hobbit and The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Number 5, if you could teleport somewhere right now, where would you go?
Where would I go right now if I could teleport? I would probably teleport to Los Angeles to visit my child, Elliot, who lives there right now. But the good news is I can take an airplane, and I'm going to do that and go visit Elliot next week.
Number 6, if you could have one superpower, what would it be?
Tricky. I would like to have many, please. But I have to say that the ability to move things with your mind is pretty appealing. So we're going to go for now with telekinesis.
Number 7, what was your favorite cartoon as a kid?
I did love cartoons. I loved a lot of them. And my favorites kind of switched off and on over time. I will say at one time there was a cartoon called Speed Buggy that I really loved. It was this beach buggy, then it talked and got in all sorts of mischief.
Number 8, what's your favorite reading activity?
Reading.
Number 9, if you could have any 3 dinner guests, who would they be?
Dinner guest. Who would they be? So let's see. From any time in history or anybody living right now?
No rules.
I like the way you think. Oh, that's a great question. It's tricky. Oh, okay. So I think Charles Dickens would be an interesting dinner guest to have, and Jane Austen. And I would say the writer of a series of seafaring novels named Patrick O'Brian. I would bring all 3 of those writers back and have dinner with them.
Number 10, what's the best piece of advice you were ever given?
Okay. I've been given some pretty good advice in my life. I think my dad used to tell me that if there was any really important decision to make, you should always sleep at least 3 nights on it. And there are exceptions to that, but I do think that's a good starting point. Sleep 3 nights on any really, really big decision before you decide.
You did amazing. Thank you
You
so
did.
much for doing that.
And thank you so much for spending this time with us.
We can't wait to read your future books.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to spend time with you, and you are excellent interviewers. So I'm honored to have been part of your adventure.